I mean, I guess one heartening thing is there's nothing new under the sun, right? I think we've always been drawn to the immediate, whether it is truth or not. We know that we like things that shock. And whether that's rooted in truth or not, if it's storytelling, if it's fiction, if it's told to you as fiction or not, we've been drawn to it. I think what's changed is obviously the medium in which it's passed, right? What used to take maybe weeks or months to spread now takes the click of a TikTok video, right? And you can suddenly reach millions, billions of people around the world. So I don't think that the attraction and the tendency for some to mislead because it gets those immediate eyes is any different throughout history, because we are all human and the human nature to kind of look at the shocking is always there, right?
That's Alice LaCour, an attorney and the co-host of the Prosecutors and the Legal Briefs podcast.
I had a friend who told me once that the weird thing about going to a school like Harvard is when you get there, you feel like you can do anything. And by the time you leave, you feel like there's only one thing you can do, and that's to go work at a big firm, right? So I did that for a year and hated it, just hated every minute of it. And the only way out that I saw was clerking. So I started applying to clerk for judges, and I clerked for a district court judge in Alabama who was just and is an amazing guy. He was so involved in his community, and he was doing all this stuff to help various people. And it really sort of opened my eyes to there is more to the world than working at a big law firm. And that was it for me as far as law firms go. It was going to be public service from that point forward.
That's Brett Talley, an attorney and also the co-host of the Prosecutors and Legal Briefs podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. This is the first of 2 episodes with Brett Talley and Alice LaCour, both attorneys who are the hosts of the Prosecutors and the Legal Briefs podcasts. Both Brett and Alice have become leading voices in the true crime community, and they frequently use their analysis of cases to support those working in the criminal justice system. Alice and Brett started the highly rated Prosecutors podcast in May of 2020, only a few months after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since Brett, Alice, and I last sat down for a conversation over the summer, they won the 2023 People's Choice Creator of the Year Award for the Prosecutors and have taken on several complex cases, including the murders of Heyman Lee and Robert Wan and the questionable conviction of Leo Schofield Jr. Brett and Alice joined me for 2 great episodes on their lives and their journeys through the justice system in the summer of 2023. I've been on their second podcast, Legal Briefs, to discuss the media circus surrounding the leaks in the case of the murders of 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby Germain in Delphi, Indiana. Brett and Alice also recently appeared on ABC's 2020 to discuss the Schofield case. They have recently begun a series on the case of Karen Reed, a Massachusetts woman who has been accused of second-degree murder in the hit-and-run death of her boyfriend, Officer John O'Keefe. Each of these cases have received a tremendous amount of attention, but in some ways, across very different times and different media, both new and old, the landscape has shifted. One thing that recently caught my attention was an article by Brett and Alice. They had written for Fox News, and they said some things that summed up my thoughts as a former journalist on how our coverage of crime in a world of YouTube, TikTok, Substack, and other social media means has created a conflict between the good that citizen journalists can do and the damage that can be done. One needs to look no further than the case of missing 22-year-old woman Gabby Petito, who went missing in 2021 and was murdered in Wyoming. An internet sleuth noticed a detail in social media posts that helped law enforcement narrow in on where she was. 4 additional bodies of missing persons were found as a direct result of the search for Petito and the suspect in her case. One only needs to look in the other direction to Idaho, where 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in December 2022. There you see the opposite effect, where a TikTok personality accused a University of Idaho associate professor with killing the students. The TikToker did it in a viral video that led to harassment of the professor, who is never a suspect. The criminal justice system has struggled with how to handle these changes. Judges now routinely impose gag orders that decrease transparency on court proceedings. Law enforcement often stands silent before and after arresting suspects, leading to a vacuum that fills with TikTok, YouTube, and Reddit rumors that ultimately may impact the public's faith in the justice system. In these episodes, we're going to discuss many cases, including the Delphi murders, the Karen Reed case, the trial and conviction of Alec Murdaugh and the murders of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul, and Lois Ann Reese, the Minnesota woman who was convicted of killing her husband and her doppelganger, but also other cases that get less attention, like Ashley Loring Heavyrunner, a 20-year-old Native woman who wanted to help find missing Indigenous women and became one herself, and the Jack family, whose 4 family members vanished without a trace in 1989 in British Columbia, and whose case is linked to other unsolved cases against Indigenous people in Canada along what is known as the Highway of Tears. I want to thank Brett and Alice for coming on. Always, they are blast to have on the podcast, but I want to especially thank Alice. I appeared on the Legal Briefs, which is one of their podcasts, in episode 95 and 96 to discuss the Delphi murders, and it really was Alice's idea to explore some of these media issues that led to these episodes. Also, Brett and Alice wrote an article for Fox News that was also an inspiration for these episodes. Today, we're going to focus on what inspired Brett and Alice and drove them toward the law and their podcast, the importance of consuming different perspectives and using critical thinking when it comes to coming to conclusions in cases and about the criminal justice system, why they end up covering some topics that they have very little interest in, and the impact new forms of media have had on the way attorneys and judges manage the criminal justice system. I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode and come back for next week's. So, Brett and Alice, as always, want to thank you for coming back on. I don't know why, after the first time you met me, you continue to speak to me, but hey.
Hey, we're so happy to be here. And you know we love you. I know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. If you are fishing for compliments, you have succeeded. Thank you for having us on.
Well, I think you guys are great too. I've really enjoyed, as you guys know, I discovered your podcast in the pandemic, and it was, it was a great comfort, and it was very interesting. And I always tell the story of not really realizing who Brett was and being like, man, that guy would make an awesome judge.
You and I are the only ones who think that. So.
Oh, I'm sure there are more. But, one of the things I really appreciated, a couple things I appreciated about your podcast that sort of stuck out to me in the true crime space: very logical, very smart, also very compassionate. You're really caring about the victims, all the players who are in the case. So, I appreciated that, enjoyed it, was really honored to be able to come onto your podcast and to be able to call you guys friends now. So everybody, you should check out the first 2 episodes that we did together. I can't promise this one will be any better. So those 2 were really, really great. I wanted to just sort of, on that note, sort of start off. I forget all the time that, many of our shared listeners know about you, but don't really, know how you got to where you are in life, how you became attorneys, how you guys met, and why on earth you decided to do a podcast. And also, I think for a lot of people, just given all the work that goes into maintaining the community, what keeps you going? So I just wanted to throw it to you guys to just talk a little bit about how you got into the law, how you ultimately met, and about the podcast.
Why don't you go ahead, Alice? Alice has
All
such a good
right.
story.
No, well, Jason, thanks for having us on. We love getting to be interviewed by you because you are so good at what you do. And thanks for, highlighting kind of the human aspect of who we are, because we now have, it's a little shocking to say, we do have public personas. And, people, because of that, feel very free to, as they should, have their opinions about us. And so oftentimes we hear much more criticism in the form of wonderful one-star reviews and Reddit posts. And people, I think, sometimes forget that there are actual people behind the voices that they may hear or choose not to hear. But, my story is, I think, not unlike a lot of people's. I did not come from a background where I knew lawyers at all. I don't think I ever met a lawyer in my life. So I didn't know that was a real professional possibility. I think studies show that, if you are exposed to professions, you realize that's a possibility, and your odds of becoming a doctor, a financial planner, a teacher, any of those things are more likely if you're exposed to it. I came from an immigrant community, even though I was born here, didn't speak English till I was 7. Had very hardworking parents, but parents who did not understand this culture, this form of government, how this world worked really at all. And so kind of in a lot of ways had to figure out my way in this society, like applied to colleges really on my own, applied for scholarships because I had no other way of paying for college, was very blessed to kind of land in a great college that not only afforded me the opportunity to go financially, but taught me how to kind of look at a world of possibilities, including the law. I went to Washington and Lee University, a very, very tiny, small
In
liberal arts
Lexington,
school
down the
in
street. Yeah,
Lexington,
well,
Virginia.
Virginia.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It really is a town of like 8,000 people. So very small town, but perfect for me because I think I needed that nurturing when the whole world seemed really big to me. And, from there, I ended up working for a professor. Still didn't think law school was a possibility for me because that seemed to be a profession for, I don't know, really educated, really connected people. And ended up,
What were you thinking about at that time as a career?
I was wanting to be an economist because I tended to be good at math and I was
Um,
good at writing economic codes. And so I thought this, there were very set rules in economics, right? Like there were proofs I could write and there were right and wrong answers. That black and white way of looking at the world was very appealing to me because I could work really hard and get the right answer. That was something that like jived with my immigrant mentality. Whereas like an amorphous profession like the law,
like
where you're
law.
judged, yeah, where you're judged on like your mind, which that's very scary, right? Especially when you kind of have this imposter syndrome growing up in a culture that's not your own, which is like my mind
Mm,
can't possibly be as good as someone whose parents were judges,
fully.
whose parents were
Yeah.
lawyers, who spoke English from the time they were born, right? I mean, these are just things that go through your mind on, you don't even know they're part of your consciousness until you grow up out of it and have people in your life who show you that that's not the way this world we live in, which I'm very lucky to be a part of. And so was going to pursue something I thought I could excel in, which
Where it
to
felt
me had
safe.
right or wrong answers.
Yeah.
And then ended up going to law school only because I worked for an economics professor who happened to also be a law professor. And he was like, you know what? You're okay at economics, but I think you'd really like law school. And I was like, I don't think I can do that. And he really helped me through that whole process and I think changed my life.
You know what it was he saw in you that screamed law?
I think he saw in me that maybe I wasn't going to be a great economist. I'm not kidding.
He's like, if you considered something like law, that's
Anything else.
easier.
Anything else. Maybe things that didn't have right or wrong answers.
But it did change your life, you said. And so, where'd you go to school and how'd you pick school for
Sure.
law
I
school?
was
Yeah.
foolish and didn't even know that it was hard to go to a school like Yale. And so I applied to just a couple of schools because the reason I only applied to a couple of schools was not because I was cocky. It was because applications cost a lot of money and I didn't have a lot of money. And so I picked 3 schools to apply to because that was like all the money I had in my bank account. And one of them was Yale, and I got in. I don't know why or how. I really probably shouldn't have. I think this proves that the less you know, the better you are off in life. I didn't know that was something I shouldn't go for. And that also changed my life because Yale actually gave me, funnily enough, more financial aid than any other law school that accepted me,
Oh, wow.
even though they were lower ranked just because they had the resources. And again, being from my background, I was like, well, of course I would pick the financially sound choice, which obviously was also a very good school to go to. But I didn't know those sorts of things when I was making my decisions.
Oh, that's wild. That's wild. So the and then so from there, you graduate law school. How do you end up on the path to be a prosecutor as opposed to becoming a very, very wealthy defense attorney?
I think my whole life, I have felt very indebted to the life I was born into. My parents
Mm.
came to the United States for a better life. And by all accounts, they had wild success because all their kids went to college. We all speak fluent English, something that they couldn't have ever imagined. And both of my parents have many siblings. I have many cousins who live in basically every continent except for Antarctica. So I have, cousins all over the world who live in very different situations than I do. I wouldn't say I'm any smarter than them. I'm luckier in a lot of ways, and it wasn't anything I earned. And so from a very young age, I felt very indebted to, public service. I felt like it was what I was called to do because I didn't deserve a lot of the things that were given to me, but I had to make good use of it. And I felt a lot of kind of meaning in serving in a public servant role, the government that kind of afforded me all
Yeah,
of these amazing things.
it was a way
So
to
that's
give
that's what I
back.
started to do. Right.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And then, Brett, we're probably getting near the part of the story where you guys meet. How did you end up? Where did you grow up? What was life like? How did you end up on this path?
So I'm from sort of a coal mining part of Alabama and didn't know any lawyers either. Didn't really expect to be a lawyer. My mind was always very Alabama centric. So, my big goal was to go to Alabama for college. And that was what I wanted to do. And obviously I did that. I didn't apply to any other colleges other than Alabama. That was the only place I wanted to go. And then when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I was a history and a philosophy major. So unless I wanted to starve, I had to figure out something else to do because I wasn't going to be a history professor or a philosophy professor. And law was one of those things, you grow up sort of smart kid in the middle of nowhere. Everybody just thinks you're going to be a lawyer or a doctor. And unlike Alice, I have no ability in math or science. So I was definitely not going to be a doctor. So lawyer was sort of what I was going to do. And I just expected that I'd go to Alabama. And my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, we dated for a very long time, sort of, I really have her to thank for it because she kind of expanded my horizons on what I could do. But in my mind, for me, Georgetown was always where I wanted to go. That was sort of my ultimate. I really could not imagine anything beyond Georgetown. Really, anything north of Washington, D.C. It was just too much. But I applied to Harvard, kind of like Alice, just on a whim. And I don't know why, but I got in. I think I've said this before, and I'm pretty sure this is true, that Harvard, they try and get one person from each state. And I think I was just the person from Alabama that year.
Alabama.
Yeah.
Was it your wife who suggested the idea of applying to Harvard? Is that what?
Harvard. So I'd applied to Georgetown. I got into Georgetown. I got some financial aid. Harvard, unlike Yale, does not give you any financial aid. So that wasn't going to happen. But I just applied to Harvard on, I don't know. It was like, when else are you going to apply to Harvard? Why not? It's, whatever the fee is. And so
Be
I
honest,
applied.
it was Legally Blonde.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's hard. So I just applied. And then I got in, and it felt like one of those things that how you can't say no to that. You have to go.
Yeah.
And like Alice, I always felt sort of this debt to everybody who came before me. I mean, obviously, where I came from was a very poor place. Most of Alabama was very poor for a very long time, but that area in particular, coal mining country. And there were a lot of people in my life who'd made a lot of sacrifices so that I could do the things that I was doing. So I felt like this was something I had to do. And when I finished, like a lot of people, I intended fully to always go into some sort of public service. But if there's one thing big law does to you and big law schools do to you, and I'm talking to all of you out there who are in law school, they convince you that the only thing you can do at a law school is go to a big firm. I had a friend who told me once that the weird thing about going to a school like Harvard is when you get there, you feel like you can do anything. And by the time you leave, you feel like there's only one thing you can do, and that's to go work at a big firm. Right. So I did that for a year and hated it, just hated every minute of it. And the only way out that I saw was clerking. So I started applying to clerk for judges, and I clerked for a district court judge in Alabama who was just and is an amazing guy. He was so involved in his community, and he was doing all this stuff to help various people. And it really sort of opened my eyes to there is more to the world than working at a big law firm. And that was it for me as far as law firms go. It was going to be public service from that point forward. So I worked for him, I worked for another judge. I worked on a presidential campaign. I worked for a senator. I worked for my state AG's office. Ended up at DOJ where Alice was. And that's how we met.
And you left off writing a couple books too.
I did. I wrote a few books. In I wrote some books in my off time. I hunted for some ghosts. I tried to keep it. I mean, as everyone knows by this point, I think I have very eclectic tastes. So, and then, like I said, Alice and I met and we became friends. We ended up leaving DC and going to the exact same place, fortuitous. And then we started talking about true crime all the time. And
the real question is who stalked who?
Yeah, exactly. After much effort, I finally convinced Alice in a sleep-deprived state to do a podcast with me. And here we are.
What did you guys think when you, and it's probably different for both of you, what did you guys think would happen when you first started the podcast? I'm guessing the People's Choice Award wasn't on the list.
No.
I did not envision that we'd still be doing it 4 years later. I did not envision it would be something that people who didn't know about it in our personal lives would find out about it by accident because it had gotten that big, if that makes sense.
Which was nobody, by the way.
Which was nobody.
Our spouses knew that we did this podcast, and that was it. We kept it from everybody else.
I mean, and it still blows my mind that people listen, right? I mean, I was taking my kids to school this morning and walking into the parking lot, and this sweet old lady that I go to the gym with, I only go to workout classes meant for really geriatrics because that's my speed. And she was like, "Sweetheart, I've been meaning to ask you. I turned on the TV the other day and I was like, you know who that girl looks like? She looks like Alice. And that wasn't you, was it?" And I was like, "Yes, ma'am, that was me." She goes, "I don't understand." That happens in our real lives, which this is an exemplar to tell you how it has gone beyond, I think, both of our wildest dreams. It was meant to be, honestly, a really fun way for us to get to hang out with each other when the world shut down during COVID. And no matter what, if nobody listened to it, it didn't matter to me because we had a lot of fun. Our spouses are just as much a part of the podcast as we are. They're just off mic, right? They are the real heroes in the background. And so if it was the four of us, it was like the way we hung out. We're weird. This is like the way our couple friends hang out is by making this podcast. And
so in a way,
people into it is amazing.
You were just, when you first started the podcast, it sounds like you were doing just what you and Brett normally did anyway. You just happened to be recording it.
Yeah, pretty much. My goal, I wanted to get invited to go to CrimeCon because I really wanted to go to CrimeCon. So that was my goal. And we accomplished that. So I feel like we've met I never thought it would be anything like it is. I mean, it's absolutely a blessing. I'm still not entirely sure what it is that draws people in. And as Alice and I talk about all the time, it constantly feels like something that's just going to sort of end eventually. That just at some point, people are just they're gonna stop listening and say, I don't know why I ever started listening to this, and it'll just kind of peter away, and then we'll go back to our regular lives. I mean, that's sort of in my mind still what's going to happen.
So it was obviously a surprise to both of you guys that I ended up doing as well as it did. One of the things that I would imagine, just like any, Alice, you were making the point before, you have public personas. It's difficult, right? It's difficult to be in the public eye. You have a lot of work related to the podcast. It's like a business too. You have all these things, and you have your broader community and your listener base. What keeps you going is my question. Like, what is it that really keeps you guys going? Because it's not easy.
Fame and
I have
glory.
my answer, but it's gonna get all schmaltzy. So I'll let you go, Brett, because you're gonna say something snarky.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I'll say this: there are ways in which it was more fun that first year, when it really was just us, and we didn't know what we were doing, and we were kind of clawing our way through it, and nobody knew who we were, and we just did whatever we wanted to, and it was probably rough, but it was just a lot of fun. And now there is more pressure. Now I feel like there's all these people counting on us to do a good job. We do these cases. Like you talked about Karen Reed. We're doing Karen Reed right now. And I just feel this immense pressure to do a good job on Karen Reed. Like
all I did today
everybody
was listen to the trial all day.
Right.
Oh, wow.
All day.
Wow.
But why do we keep doing it? Number one, I really enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy it immensely. I love talking to Alice. Alice is awesome. I always like true crime, and getting to talk about true crime to someone like Alice, who is both my friend, but also is brilliant. I mean, I love, and you guys probably catch this, and we're not good actors and we don't script anything. When Alice says something, I'm like, that is so awesome. That is so amazing. I'm so glad you said that. That's not like written in the script. That's really a good point, Alice. I'm glad you saw that. No, it's just like talking to somebody and seeing how Alice's mind works, and her, like an idea starts coming into my head, and then Alice perfectly encapsulates it. It's just, that is so much fun. And I do love the community that's grown up around it, and the people. I consider a lot of the people in that community to be friends. I love seeing them. I enjoy interacting with them. I like their ideas, and I like learning about new and different things, which is one reason I like the law. It's because every case is different, and every case is an opportunity to find out things you never knew. And the same thing with the podcast. We're constantly learning stuff through doing the cases, either through the research or through the reaction by people who, it's like the worm farm, one of our early cases. I didn't know what a worm farm was, but there were all these people who did, and they explained what they were.
I don't remember that case. Which one was
there? Was the lady who she ran a worm farm with her husband, and then she murdered him.
Oh, yes.
On, like,
yes.
Forget her name.
Yes.
People still comment about the worm farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say my answer is pretty similar to that, but it's mainly twofold when you strip away everything, because it's a lot of work. Someone was commenting this weekend to Mr. Alice, like, oh yeah, but like all she's doing now is the podcast, right? And he was like, oh no, she's a full-time litigation partner at a big law firm. And they were like, why would she do that? And the reason why really is twofold. I mean, Brett's one of my best friends, and because of this podcast, I get to hang out with him way more than any of my other friends. And as you all know, in adult life, it's just really hard to get together. And as a result, like the four of us, are Mr. and Mrs. Brett, Mr. and Mrs. Alice, we all get to hang out way more than if the podcast didn't exist. So first of all, every time we record, it's fun. It is literally fun. I kind of forget that there are people watching. I forget that it will ultimately be published. You guys probably know that because I say a lot of things that after the fact, I'm like, oh my goodness, did I say that? Is because I'm getting to hang out with my friend. And then second, the podcast kind of is like an idealized version of my job, right? I practice the law. And the reason I keep practicing the law, despite having a podcast that could be a full-time job, is because I actually love the law. And this podcast, by diving into these cases, we get to do something that we criticize prosecutors and investigators all the time. We get to have hindsight. We get to see how to fix a case, how to better argue a case. And people are always like, oh, you guys are brilliant. You would have done better. It's not that. It's that we never have the time when we actually work our cases to sit down and analyze them the way we do the podcast cases. And so in a lot of ways, it's like working through your id, right? You get to basically live a different version of yourself because you're not actually in trial. This person isn't actually your client or someone you're prosecuting. And you get to try out different ways to do something when it's kind of not, there's no risk, right? But you get to use your brain in the way that we all hope to do in our profession.
That's what I loved about journalism. We could critically think and analyze everyone else, hindsight 2020, and tell them how wrong they were now. But I mean, I get that it gives you an opportunity to get involved in all sorts of things that you wouldn't otherwise. But you made that, you were making that point earlier about just sort of the chance to sort of look back and review things. There have been a couple times, do I remember this correctly, where you guys have actually gone and talked to law enforcement and been able to give them advice about things. I recall you saying once something about doing that. Was that related to the Delphi case and media?
So not Delphi specifically, but because of our platform, we've been invited to give trainings to law enforcement, not specifically about any case, but because we have the benefit of prosecuting cases and also seeing cases all over the nation and seeing where they've kind of had their downfalls. And that platform has allowed people to know how to reach out to us, to ask us to kind of teach our law enforcement, what are the pitfalls that you are seeing that other law enforcement officers are doing that we can avoid? Because we say this all the time on our podcast, but the vast majority, and really, thankfully, every law enforcement officer I've worked with truly is trying to get it right. You're always going to have bad eggs in any profession, but the vast majority are people trying to get it right. And people reaching out to us to do these trainings is like absolute, it warms my heart because they open up their files to us and they're like, help us be better. And that's exactly what you hope to have from your law enforcement officers.
Brett?
Yeah, and I got to talk to Jason Landry's dad was at CrimeCon, and they're still looking for him. And I was glad to be able to tell him that when we did that training, and there were a couple hundred. I don't even know how many police officers there were from all over the state.
He's the young man who went missing in Texas.
In Texas,
okay,
right. And the police officer who responded did a terrible job. And it's hard to say if that police officer had taken that case more seriously, would there have been a different outcome? But one of the good things that comes out of it is that was one of the cases we talked about. And we used it as an example for all these officers about when you come upon a scene like this, you have to do your job. You can't let your initial assumption mean you don't even check to see, is this actually a DUI? Is this actually a walk-off? If the officer had spent any time at all beyond just seeing the car and saying this is a DUI walk-off, if he'd just gone down the street, found the backpack, found the clothes, he would have realized, no, this is something very different. But he didn't do that. And that is an easy trap to fall into, but it's heartening to me that we can take those stories that are so tragic and so terrible and hopefully prevent something like that from happening in the future by giving law enforcement the tools they need to do a better job. Because Alice is 100% right. Despite what you would think, if you followed true crime, the vast majority of police officers, they're in it because they want to help people. They want to make their communities better and stronger and safer. And they often just need to be pointed in the right direction about how to do that.
Yeah. Because they are, they're in tough jobs. You get tired. If you don't have good heuristics. I was just in Vermont over the weekend and I went up to Montgomery, Vermont, where Breonna Maitland went missing in 2004. And, there were just a couple. They're always, every time I take one of these trips where I visit a place that I've read or heard about, I always get surprised. But like a couple things stuck out to me. One of which was just how unbelievably close the where she disappeared, the barn where she disappeared was to her actual work. And, getting on the ground makes me rethink things. Okay. So like probably some random person did not catch her in the, 45 seconds or whatever it was. But I got to the site and I thought to myself, wow, it's really close to the road. There's not a lot of space. How could any cop drive by this scene and not think, huh, something very wrong happened here? But then I remind myself, right? When you're tired, when you're exhausted, when so many things are going on, you've got to have these shortcuts in your head that scream to you. And so it sounds like that kind of training gives you it's almost like you guys are doing case reviews, 50, 40 case reviews every year, and it gives you a chance to do lessons learned for people. That's kind of cool. I wanted to jump back to something. I know you'd said before that Alice, I remember you quoting John Keats, and it's where he said, "Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty," and that's really stuck in my head. Like, you know, beauty is something so subjective, and you can find it in all sorts of things. But truth is really objective; doesn't really have personal bias. But they're totally intertwined, right? This idea that beauty is truth and truth is beauty, and it's something I've thought over and over again outside of the context of what you were saying. I was thinking about it in the context of the tensions that exist when it comes to media coverage in the criminal justice system. And by that, I mean, as somebody who's a former journalist, like, we wrap ourselves in the First Amendment, as you know, it's like still wrapped around me. I can't get the pieces off. Um, and there's something about like the importance to truth, to being able to hold the players within the system accountable, to be able to sort of separate the rumors and the fiction that exist. And I feel like we're sort of falling further and further away from doing that, whether it's content creators or it's traditional media. And I'm wondering whether, like, in thinking of that Keats quote, whether it gives you any ideas about, sort of what the role of sort of the media should be in the criminal justice system.
I mean, I guess one heartening thing is there's nothing new under the sun, right? I think we've always been drawn to the immediate, whether it is truth or not. We know that we like things that shock, and whether that's rooted in truth or not, if it's storytelling, if it's fiction, if it's told to you as fiction or not, we've been drawn to it. I think what's changed is obviously the medium in which it's passed, right? What used to take maybe weeks or months to spread now takes the click of a TikTok video, right? And you can suddenly reach millions, billions of people around the world. So I don't think that the attraction and the tendency for some to mislead because it gets those immediate eyes is any different throughout history, because we are all human, and the human nature to kind of look at the shocking is always there, right?
People love the dramatic. Yeah.
They do. But I think what is undergirded once the shock is finished, and you asked us, what's the most shocking thing, or what did you not expect about the podcast? I didn't think we'd stay around because I thought people would become bored of it, because we are not meant to be shockers. That's where we call ourselves the cold water prosecutors for that purpose. We try to be the anti-shockers. So why are people still listening 4 years later? Because I have faith that at the very core of each person, even if we all turn to look at the accident at core, we are, geared towards wanting to seek beauty and wanting to seek truth, because our very humanity kind of relies on it. And so even if you're distracted throughout the day by the shocking, when it's quiet at night, when your computer's off, when there are no other voices around and you are left alone with yourself, which all of us are left to at some point, just less so in today's society than others. But at the end of your life, or when, you're stuck with your own thoughts, there's really only you and truth, and the lack of truth. And that's something everyone has to face at some point. So I think there is still a real desire for it. I think there's just a lot of noise, but I think that noise has always been there. And I say that to, maybe that's the Pollyanna in me, that I don't think today's situation is really any different. It may be different in degree and the way it had manifests itself. But what we are seeing is something that is, a tale as old as time. And there have always been people throughout history who continue to seek the truth. And, I think history has proven them to be the ones that we should look to. And they've always existed. And I think they continue to exist today. But as consumers, I would say in some ways we have more immediate power because of the social media and immediate, sending out of information that we may, in some ways, may have more power today than a century ago. And so, more so, your eyes and your clicks are your voting power today in terms of making sure those who are actually seeking out truth, who are doing, investigative journalism, get the support they need to do this work because it's hard, it takes time, and it doesn't give you that immediate splash of everyone's looking at you and now you're viral. The truth is not viral, but the truth
Right.
endures.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting what you were saying made me really think that like truth and beauty are the things that help us make sense of the world around us. Some of the tools are more immediate now, right? And I think Brett and I have probably talked a lot about how, the history of yellow journalism or all the different sort of similar things that happened. But when the headline "Remember the Maine" went out, and about the boat sinking in Havana Harbor, there were newspapers that got printed the next day. It did not go over the world instantaneously. And I'll throw it to both of you. Do you think that some of the tools now, sort of, I'm thinking YouTube, TikTok, et cetera, make it harder to sort of pause to seek the truth because you're constantly getting inundated with things, or that is not the creators are not incentivized to?
Well, there's no incentive to pause. If you pause, you lose in today's media, right? I mean, the incentive is the hot take is the take now. That's what people do. They hear something and they immediately go to YouTube or go to TikTok or whatever to deliver their take. And they know that the more sort of outrageous take it is, the more likely they're going to get listens and they're going to get eyes. I mean, they're not even necessarily interested in people agreeing with them as much as generating discussion, creating the mob. And I think, one thing I think is important to remember is civilization is not the natural state of humanity. Like the mob is. That is what we tend to be. We tend to be that, and we always have. And it's taken, thousands of years to sort of build up a civilization and a system that is supposed to be deliberate and is supposed to think through these things, that is supposed to try cases in courtrooms, not in, shouting matches on the street corner, right? But while I agree that it's always been there, I think you're right in that before, number one, you at least had gatekeepers of some sort. Sometimes they were good and sometimes they were bad. Now you don't have those. There was a little bit more reflection. There was a little bit more time to think things through, and the return wasn't so immediate either. I mean, the fact that you can have immediate, like Alice said, viral attention and viral growth if you're just willing to be a little outrageous. It's so intoxicating for creators. And I think it is really hard to avoid. And I think people, I mean, look, I like conspiracies. I love conspiracies. I talk about them all the time. I just don't really find myself getting wrapped up in them very often because I like to step back and see what's wrong with them. But I think what we see a lot of people, they really pour themselves into this. It becomes part of their being, believing.
Identity, yeah.
Exactly. A certain story, being a part of that story, being on a certain side, as if it were a sporting event or a political debate. That becomes a key part of their being. And once you're there, there's no dissuading you with facts and argument, right? It becomes a matter of faith.
And it's one of the things in this sort of environment that I think about, just sort of hearkening back to, the way it worked when I was a journalist, or at least, I was covering crime. We would occasionally get the heads up that an arrest was happening. We would get some background. We would report the stories. We would, have time to, I'm thinking our pre-internet, because I'm both pre and post-internet days. Time to check with other sources. Our deadlines would be late at night, and we'd turn around the story for the next day and get to the best first version of the truth that we could. You know, reach out to family members, try to find, a victim's family or whoever, right? And you knew on that first draft, you were not going to be perfect. But that you had an opportunity to come back at it over and over again each day and get a deeper version. But now I see that same thing being done I was waiting for some Supreme Court case last week, and I was like, how is the hot take out like 5 minutes after the opinion is released? Like, no one has read this yet. I mean, maybe they let the Supreme Court reporters see it 4 minutes in advance, but no one has really read this yet. So like in that environment, it just seems like the vacuum that could exist for our daily reporting, or for us to investigate something over the course of a year, or for us to not cover every hiccup in a trial, doesn't really exist. And I think for two reasons. One is just, the speed of the newer forms of media, but also when you don't have time to reflect as a journalist, you have to cover everything because everything could be big and everything isn't really big. So you end up finding yourself covering a lot of very unimportant things. And I was just curious what you guys thought about the current environment and the risk of having a vacuum, because I feel like a lot of law enforcement is still using the model that existed before any publication was on the internet, and it's not working as well.
Well, I think Alice and I, we cover things sometimes that we don't want to cover, that we don't actually have much interest in covering, because we know if we don't cover it, that there's not going to be an alternative, maybe less dramatic, less controversial take on something. It just feels like we have an obligation to do it. We found ourselves doing that a lot in Delphi. We kind of pulled back from Delphi a little bit because it was like every day, there's a new filing. You're really going to cover every frivolous filing in a case, when we've been involved in cases before, and you see this stuff all the time. And it's actually not that big a deal when the defense files a motion to dismiss. That happens all the time, but we got caught in this cycle where we just felt like we have to cover this. We have to say something because there are people out there waiting for our take. And if they don't hear our take, then they are liable to believe something that is completely baseless.
So it was sort of sucking you into the problem that we were talking about.
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that I think more so than any other period in time, consumers being all of us, right? Content creators are consumers as well, have more of an opportunity to affect that. The reason there are hot takes, and you're always going to get those hot takes. And look, we did not cover the Murdaugh trial in real time. We were just behind it. We're not covering Karen Reed in real time. We're just behind it. And part of it is wanting to take the time to listen to the hundreds of hours of trial testimony, which cannot possibly be done, to have a hot take, to listen and then immediately comment without the benefit of taking time to reflect. There's a reason we do that. And going back to we can't believe we're doing this 4 years later, it also took us 4 years to build up a listenership. We were not a one season hit wonder. We didn't come out with an episode. People are like, everyone must listen to them. I mean, we've been very lucky in building a listener base, but it's been slow and steady because we are not taking those viral takes. But as a result, I think now we've kind of built up capital that we're not going to just go off the cuff and say things because there's a vacuum, because there's nothing on Reddit yet. Something will be on Reddit. Choose not to be the one to click it. That's kind of where the consumerism, I think, can really help, because once you start engaging, that's where the rabbit holes start coming. Take a breath, read it for yourself first. We're always looking for someone else to give us the take. Wouldn't it be an amazing world if all of us first, took a beat to read the indictment, or took a beat to read what an indictment is, the definition of an indictment, before we decide to jump on Twitter and call everyone a conspiracy theorist? Because what does that add? And this, I think, applies to consumers just as much as content creators. We've said this from day one. We'll stop doing this podcast when we think that we are not adding anything new to the cases that we cover. We though we cover cases that are well covered, our goal in covering them is to bring a new angle or a new way of thinking, or from our experience, something that you haven't heard before, not because we think we're special, but because we don't want to seek to add to the noise. That should be the same as consumers. When we discuss these cases, whether it's in, by the water cooler at work or on Twitter or on Reddit or in a chat or some social media group, you know, does it help any conversation in life to just be adding like another, check mark? Me too. What does me too mean? Me too. And then give your take on it, because guess what? You have a unique voice that no one else in the world has. You have experiences that have shaped your worldview that nobody else has. You actually have a unique take. Don't let anyone take that away from you. And I think a lot of these hot takes have actually convinced consumers that we don't know what to think. And that is the greatest lie that's being told to this generation, and why we always say, don't take our word for it. Go read it. Go
Look
read it
other
yourself.
places.
Here's my take, my experience. But think about the dignity of every human being. Every single one of you have a unique life, and a unique set of life experiences has led you to who you are today. I can't claim to speak for you. No one can claim to speak for you. So why have we allowed all these content creators, not just content creators, news media organizations, publications that are well respected, tell us that we don't know any better, and so we have to believe their take? That is a great lie.
It was very interesting. So when I was an intern, I was working in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, and a guy named David Shribman was our bureau editor, and he had a lot of smart ideas. But the one thing he demanded of me was that I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, that I read the front page and the editorial page of the New York Times every day. Same for the Washington Post, that I read the Weekly Standard, which was a conservative magazine, that I read what I can't remember what Mother Jones, right? So he had this list of completely different takes, and he wanted me to read the New Yorker, and that was his one sort of demand. And his point was, I want you to see as many possible perspectives as you possibly can, because you need to decide things for yourself and not be led. And I thought that was great advice. That's really, really helped me.
And it's become really easy to be led now. I mean, if you want to be led, you can be led all you want. You can pick whatever perspective you want to have, and you'll find lots of people who will reinforce that, never challenge it. And I don't think that's very healthy. The good thing about Alice and I think Alice is the same way I am. I have very little filter. I don't think I'm capable of just giving a take because I think it'll be popular. I just don't think I'm capable of doing that. You would see right through it if I tried. So that's one reason I think, not just because we have some moral high horse we're on, just because I think I'm incapable of doing it. Like, I'm going to tell you what I think.
We're bad business people. We're bad business people.
Well, I share that in common with you.
Yeah.
I want to take a moment to thank some of our Patreons for their contributions to helping us continue to do the work that we hope brings good into the world and delivers those silver linings. For this episode, I'd like to thank some of them: Paula D., Jason Yu, Amy, the Prosecutors Podcast, Kristen K., Marie H., Bob R., Elizabeth M., Anya C., Kevin G., Allison D., Alora C., Robert P., Sophie T., Catherine E., Abby O., Gina K., Mandy S., and Michael E. Not only does your support help us make a difference by helping us tell these stories, you're also an inspiration, and you've come up with some of the best episode ideas. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. For the rest of you, if you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.